I think I did give the answer in answer to Senator Baker, that you did need to have a system that gave confidence in the election, and that I regard that confidence as adding to the validity of elections. It's, after all, it's since the election is so basic to our way of life, and we fought world wars to have elections. Absolutely. That we need to make sure that they're properly organized. That isn't a subtraction from an election, it's a way of honoring the election that we do. But I think that your answer really illustrates the need for a discussion that isn't based on principle, but is based on the nitty-gritty practicalities. Mm-hmm. We need to know if 120,000 people really are being disenfranchised, or whether they're not, and if so, how we can solve the problem. And I think the less highfalutin the language is about it, and the more common sense we get down to making sure that there actually isn't a problem and that everybody is satisfied, that is the answer, rather than going into more and more high-flown rhetoric, one side attacking the other. And that's what I think is needed and is possible.
Thank you very much.
Senator McIntyre.
Thank you, Doctor, for your presentation. In looking at your biographical summary, I note that you are the president of the International Political Science Association's Research Committee on Political Finance and Political Corruption. So I don't think you'll have any problems answering my questions, because this question has to do with donations, and more particularly donations bequeathed through wills. Canada has strict limits on money in politics in order to ensure a level playing field. For example, in 2006, the government reduced the personal contribution limit and eliminated the corporate and union contributions. However, under the current law, donations set aside in wills are not subject to the contribution limit. There's no question that limiting contributions provided in wills eliminates an exception for wealthy individuals to provide large corporations large donations to political parties. Under Bill C-14, any contribution bequeathed in a will would be subject to the contribution limit and would only be permitted once. What are your thoughts on this, and can you tell us anything regarding donations in your country?
Well, first, to give a plug to the International Political Science Association, since you mentioned it, it is having its next World Congress in Montreal, and Montreal is the headquarters of the International Political Science Association, and so Canada is the center of our world. The issue of control of political donations is a very difficult and very controversial one for a number of reasons. One is that you certainly do have the principle of the level playing field, but you also have the principle of freedom of expression. And freedom of expression is often restricted if people can't publish, can't spend money. I mean, for example, when there was British legislation to restrict what interest groups could spend before an election, there was widespread objection on the ground that it stopped freedom of expression. The trouble with limits that are designed to have the level playing field is that they're often very difficult to enforce. For example, in Britain, we find that if you want to influence politics, you don't do it by giving money to a political party, you do it by owning a newspaper and running a newspaper. So are you to say that nobody is to spend more than $1,500 on a newspaper, because then the rich can have more money to influence the political process than the poor? In other words, that if you have the limit only on political parties, but not on newspapers, not on interest groups and other bodies, you don't control the role of money in politics altogether. And I think that scholars have found that limits on either on spending or on donations actually do lead to evasion, and so aren't an ideal form of regulation, although they do exist in many countries, and they do exist in my own country, in Britain, though not to the extent that they are in Canada. And so I sympathize with the view that, that there should be those limits, but they're not a panacea.
Okay, thank you, Doctor.
Now, do you want me to comment on the question of legacies?
Yes, please do.
In Britain, we also have this as a loophole, and indeed we have very strict tax laws on inheritance taxes. But you have considerable relief if you give money to a political party. It is something of an exception under British law, and is an issue. I mean, I have very mixed feelings about spending limits, but largely because of the loopholes that exist in those limits. And I feel that if you're to restrict political parties without at the same time restricting interest groups and newspapers, then you're in trouble. If you do restrict interest groups, which I think you do have rules on this in Canada, and there have been law cases on this in Canada, then questions of freedom of speech arise, and so there is a real underlying conflict between the level playing field and freedom of expression. And interestingly enough, when Monsieur Méron and I were participating in the Commonwealth Electoral Network's discussion of this in London last year, this was one of the trade-offs that was under discussion.
Thank you, Doctor.
Mind adding
if that's a vague answer, it's because it's a difficult question.
Wouldn't mind adding a comment, because I represent Ontario in the Senate, and certainly Ontario, with respect to third-party advertising, there's been considerable concern in that province when in the last election a third-party group called Working Families spent, and the political parties have caps, limits, legislative caps on what they can spend. This third-party organization spent more than all of the political parties combined in the province of Ontario. So I think that there are legitimate concerns around that, and I guess from where I sit, I think I don't see how you could ever enter into the area of trying to limit what newspapers or other media outlets say or do with respect to political campaigns.
Comment.